The chamber stretched for nearly a mile beneath the surface of Delos Prime, and within its cold stone walls stood 10,000 tablets that had frustrated the greatest minds in the galaxy for 3,000 years. Daniel Carter walked slowly between the rows of ancient stone, his footsteps echoing in the silence as Counselor Vethris watched him with barely hidden contempt. "You understand," the counselor said, her silver scales catching the dim light, "that our finest scholars have spent lifetimes on these tablets, and you are here only because we have exhausted every other option." Daniel nodded without turning around, his eyes fixed on the intricate markings that covered each stone surface like frozen music. "I understand," he replied quietly. Laura Bennett stood near the entrance, her arms crossed as she observed the exchange between her colleague and the alien official who clearly wished they had never been invited. Humanity had joined galactic civilization only 50 years ago, and most species still considered them primitive newcomers who had stumbled into the stars by accident rather than design. The Corvani were an ancient people with a proud history spanning hundreds of thousands of years, and they did not appreciate being told that a young species might succeed where they had failed. High Scholar Yentis emerged from behind a pillar, his robes flowing like water as he approached the human visitors with open hostility in his 4 dark eyes. "This is an insult," he declared loudly enough for everyone in the chamber to hear, "and I have registered my formal objection with the council, because these creatures have no business touching artifacts of such importance." Larva stepped forward with a sharp response ready on her tongue, but Daniel raised his hand slightly to stop her. "I understand your concerns," Daniel said calmly, "and I promise that I will treat these artifacts with the respect they deserve." Yentis made a sound of disgust and turned away, his opinion of humans clearly unchanged by politeness. Counselor Vethris gestured for Daniel to continue his examination, though her expression suggested she expected nothing useful to come from his presence. The Precursor Archive had been discovered 3 millennia ago by Corvani explorers who had stumbled upon a sealed chamber deep beneath the mountains of their homeworld. Inside, they found 10,000 stone tablets covered in markings that matched no known language in the galaxy. And despite centuries of effort by the finest linguists and most advanced artificial intelligences, not a single word had been translated. The precursors themselves remained a mystery, wrapped in legend and speculation. They had existed millions of years ago, long before any current species had evolved intelligence, and the fragments of their technology that had been found scattered across the galaxy had revolutionized civilization itself. Faster than light travel, artificial gravity, and countless other wonders had been reverse-engineered from precursor artifacts. But their language remained completely opaque. The tablets were believed to contain directions to their language remained directions to opaque. The tablets were believed to contain directions to a Pankapaznesia, precursor library, or perhaps even their homeworld. And whoever unlocked their secrets would gain access to knowledge beyond imagination. This was why the Corvani had swallowed their pride and invited a human specialist to examine the archive. Daniel Carter was not famous or particularly distinguished by galactic standards, but he had demonstrated an unusual talent for pattern recognition that had caught the attention of certain officials. He had solved linguistic puzzles that had stumped experts for decades, and he had done so with a casual ease that some found unsettling. Now he stood before the greatest linguistic mystery in known history, and everyone expected him to fail just like all the others before him. Laura joined him as he moved deeper into the archive, the tablets rising on either side like monuments to ancient genius. "How are you feeling?" she asked quietly. "Curious," Daniel replied without looking away from the stones. "Because something about these markings feels familiar." Larva frowned at that statement because no human had ever seen precursor writing before. Familiar how? She pressed. Daniel did not answer immediately. instead walking to a tablet near the center of the chamber and leaning close to examine the symbols. Carved into its surface, the markings were complex and beautiful, flowing in patterns that seemed almost organic in their design. He traced them with his eyes, following the curves and angles as his mind worked through possibilities that had never occurred to the alien. Scholar's archivist Senna appeared beside them, her pale blue skin and large luminous eyes marking her as a Morellian, a species known for their patience and dedication to scholarship. She had spent 40 years studying the tablets without making any progress, and the weight of that failure showed in her posture. "I welcome you to the archive," she said softly, "and I hope you will find what the rest of us could not." There was no hostility in her voice, only a tired acceptance and perhaps a faint hope that someone might finally succeed. Daniel acknowledged her with a nod before returning his attention to the tablet before him. Minutes passed in silence as he examined stone after stone, his expression shifting from curiosity to concentration to something that looked almost like recognition. Counselor Vethris grew impatient and approached with obvious irritation. "Well," she demanded, "do you have any insights to share? Or have we wasted our time bringing you here?" Daniel straightened and turned to face her with a strange light in his eyes. "These are simple," he said. The words hung in the air like a physical blow, and every scholar in the chamber turned to stare at him with expressions ranging from disbelief to outrageous, actually laughed. A harsh sound that echoed off the ancient walls. "Simple," he repeated with venom dripping from his voice. "The greatest mystery in the galaxy is simple to a creature whose species was living in caves while we were building empires." Daniel ignored the insult and gestured toward the nearest tablet. "They are not using one language," he explained, his voice calm despite the hostility surrounding him. "And that is why you could not translate them, because they are using all of them at once." Silence fell over the chamber as the meaning of his words slowly registered. Laura looked at her colleague with a mixture of surprise and pride, while Senna leaned forward with sudden intense interest. Counselor Vethris studied Daniel with new eyes, her contempt replaced by something more cautious. "Explain," she commanded. Daniel turned back to the tablets with a small smile forming on his lips. "Give me 3 days," he said, "and I will show you." The quarters assigned to Daniel were small and plain, a clear indication of how little the Kovani valued their human guests. But Daniel did not care about comfort when there was a puzzle to solve. He had requested access to Earth's linguistic databases, and Lavra had spent hours fighting through bureaucratic resistance to make it happen. Now streams of information flowed across his display screen as he compared ancient human writing systems to the markings on the precursor tablets. "You need to sleep," Laura said from the doorway, her concern evident in her voice. "Not yet," Daniel replied without looking up, "because I am close to understanding something important." Laura sighed and entered the room, sitting down across from him and watching his fingers dance across the controls. "Tell me what you are seeing," she said, "because I want to understand." Daniel paused and turned to face her, his eyes bright with the excitement of discovery. "Every species in the galaxy eventually unified their language," he began, "because it was efficient and practical. And over time they forgot their ancient writing systems and communication methods." Laura nodded slowly because this was common knowledge among galactic scholars. "But humans did not do that," Daniel continued. "And Earth still has thousands of languages and dozens of writing systems that we have preserved even if we no longer use them daily." He pulled up images of ancient scripts on his display and arranged them side by side. "Cuneiform from ancient Mesopotamia," he said, pointing to wedge-shaped marks. "Hieroglyphics from Egypt, lineae from Crete, Rongorongo from Easter Island, and hundreds more." Laura studied the images with a frown. "What does this have to do with the precursor tablets?" she asked Daniel, smiled, and added an image of precursor markings to the display. Look carefully, he instructed, and tell me if you see any similarities. Lavra leaned forward and examined the images for a long moment before her eyes widened in shock. That symbol, she whispered, pointing to a curved mark on the precursor tablet, looks almost like an Egyptian hieroglyph, and that one resembles Sumerian cuneiform, Daniel added. While this pattern here is very similar to ancient Chinese oracle bone script. Lavra sat back in her chair with disbelief written across her face. Are you saying the precursors visited Earth? She asked. I am saying they influenced our development, Daniel replied. Or perhaps they designed their language to incorporate elements from many sources across the galaxy, including our world. He stood and began pacing as he organized his thoughts. The Corvani and other ancient species unified their languages millions of years ago, he explained. And they lost the diversity of thought that comes from multiple communication systems. But humans kept that diversity, Lavra said slowly as understanding dawned. Exactly, Daniel confirmed. And that is why I can see patterns in these tablets that no one else could recognize. Because my mind was trained on dozens of different writing systems from childhood. He had grown up in a household where his grandmother spoke Korean, his father spoke Spanish, and his mother was a professor of dead languages who had taught him to read ancient scripts as bedtime stories. What had seemed like an unusual childhood was now revealing itself as perfect preparation for this momenta. Soft chime announced a visitor, and Daniel opened the door to find Archivist Senna standing in the hallway. May I enter? She asked hesitantly. Because I heard about your claims and I wish to understand. Daniel welcomed her inside and spent the next hour explaining his theory while Senna listened with growing amazement. I have studied these tablets for 40 years, she said when he finished. And I never considered that the precursors might have used a composite language system. Your people unified their writing long ago, Daniel replied gently. So you could not recognize fragments of other systems. Senna nodded sadly, because she understood that her own civilization's advancement had become a barrier to understanding. Will you teach me? She asked. Because I wish to help you translate. Daniel agreed without hesitation, because he sensed that Senna would become an invaluable ally in the work ahead. They worked through the night together, comparing symbols and mapping connections between precursor markings and ancient Earth scripts. By morning, Daniel had translated his first complete tablet, and the words it contained changed everything. To those who remember all tongues, the path opens, he read aloud, his voice trembling slightly, and to those who forget, silence remains. Senna stared at him with tears forming in her large, luminous eyes. It was a test, she whispered, and the precursors designed the archive so that only a species who preserved linguistic diversity could read it. Daniel nodded as the full weight of his discovery settled over him. They wanted to ensure that whoever inherited their knowledge would value different ways of thinking, he said. And humanity is the first species in 3,000 years to pass their test. Lavra had been silent throughout this revelation, but now she spoke with urgency in her voice. You need to tell the council immediately, she said, because this changes everything the galaxy believed about humanity. Daniel knew she was right, but he also knew that his announcement would make powerful enemies among those who had spent lifetimes failing where he had succeeded in a single night. High Scholar Yentis would not accept this quietly, and there were likely others who would see human success as an embarrassment rather than a breakthrough. Prepare a formal presentation, he said to Lavra, because tomorrow we will show the council what humanity can do. Senna reached out and placed her hand on his arm, a gesture of support from a new friend. There will be resistance, she warned, because many scholars have built their reputations on the impossibility of translation. Daniel met her eyes with quiet determination. Then we will prove them wrong, he replied, one tablet at a time. The Council Hall of Delos Prime was an ancient structure carved from living crystal, and its walls glowed with soft light as Daniel stood before the assembled representatives of a dozen species. Counselor Vethris sat at the center of the high table, her silver scales gleaming as she watched the human with an expression that mixed skepticism with reluctant curiosity. You claim to have translated precursor writing, she said. When our greatest minds have failed for 3,000 years, I have translated one tablet completely, Daniel replied calmly. And I can translate more if given time and resources. Murmurs rippled through the gathered scholars and officials as they processed this bold statement. High Scholar Yentis rose from his seat with fury blazing in his 4 dark eyes. This is absurd, he declared loudly, and I demand proof before we waste any more time on this human charade. Then proof you shall have, Daniel responded without flinching, activated the display system and projected the image of a precursor tablet onto the great screen that dominated one wall of the hall. This is tablet 742 from the Central Archive, he explained. And the scholars of Delos have studied it for over 1,000 years without progress. The markings on the tablet were complex and beautiful, flowing across the stone surface in patterns that had defied all previous attempts at it. Translation. Daniel pointed to specific symbols as he spoke, breaking down the writing system for his audience. The precursors did not create a single language, he explained, and instead they built what I call a meta-language that incorporates elements from many different communication systems. He highlighted a curved symbol near the top of the tablet. This mark resembles ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics from Earth, he said. While this cluster here shares structural similarities with Sumerian cuneiform. Yentis laughed harshly at this claim. You expect us to believe that the precursors based their writing on primitive human scribbles, he mocked. Not based on, Daniel corrected patiently, but rather connected to, because the precursors seeded elements of their communication system across many worlds, including Earth. He continued his explanation while the council listened with growing interest. Most galactic species unified their languages over time, he said, because efficiency demanded standardization, and ancient writing systems were abandoned and forgotten. Councilor Vethris leaned forward with understanding beginning to show in her eyes. But humans did not abandon their old languages, she said slowly. Exactly, Daniel confirmed. And Earth still preserves thousands of languages and dozens of writing systems that date back thousands of years. He displayed images of ancient scripts from across human history and showed how fragments of each appeared. In the precursor markings, my mind was trained to recognize patterns across multiple writing systems, he explained. And that training allowed me to see connections that were invisible to scholars who knew only unified modern languages. Archivist Senna stood and addressed the council in support of Daniel. I have worked beside him, she said, and I have witnessed his method with my own eyes. And I believe he speaks the truth. Several council members whispered among themselves, while Yentis remained standing with barely contained rage. Very well, Councilor Vethris announced. Then we shall test your claims, and if you fail, then you will leave Delos and never return. She ordered attendants to select 5 tablets at random from the archive. Tablets that Daniel had never seen before. Stones were brought into the council hall and placed on display stands where everyone could see them clearly. Daniel approached the first tablet and studied its markings for a long moment while the chamber held its breath. This tablet describes a navigation system, he said, and it contains partial coordinates for a location in the outer spiral arm of the galaxy. He moved to the second tablet and again examined its surface. This one speaks of a gift left for future generations, he continued, and it mentions a place where knowledge has been preserved against the darkness of time. Tablet after tablet he translated, reading words that had been silent for millions of years. And with each translation, the atmosphere in the council hall shifted from skepticism to astonishment when he finished the fifth tablet, describing instructions for activating precursor technology. Even Yentis had fallen silent. Counselor Vethris rose from her seat and approached Daniel with something like respect in her movements. "How is this possible?" she asked quietly. "And how did humanity develop this ability while the rest of us could not?" Daniel considered her question carefully before answering. "Humanity has always been chaotic," he said. "And we fought wars over language and culture for thousands of years. And we never achieved the unity that other species found." He gestured at the tablets surrounding them. "We thought this was a weakness," he continued, "but the precursors saw it differently, because they believed that diversity of thought was the greatest treasure a species could possess." Lavra stepped forward with emotion evident in her voice. "They designed the archive as a test," she said, "and the prize goes to whoever values different ways of thinking." The council hall erupted in excited conversation as the implications of this discovery spread. Through the crowd, Counselor Vethris raised her hand for silence and made an official announcement. "The human Daniel Carter is hereby granted full authority over the archive translation project," she declared, "and all resources necessary for his work will be provided immediately." Yentis turned and stormed out of the hall without speaking, his reputation as a scholar crumbling with every step. But Lavra noticed something troubling as she watched the departing crowd. Some council members did not look pleased by the success, and their expressions suggested fear rather than celebration. "Daniel," she whispered as they left the hall, "I think we may have made some dangerous enemies today." Daniel nodded grimly, because he had seen those fearful faces too. "Some doors have been closed for a very long time," he replied, "and not everyone wants them opened." That night a message appeared on his personal device from an unknown sender. The Pia words were brief and chilling. "Stop translating, because some doors should remain closed." Before Daniel could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Someone was trying to destroy the archive. Daniel ran through the corridors of the facility, with Lavra and Senna close behind him as alarms screamed overhead and emergency lights painted the walls in flashing red. "The archive," Senna gasped as they reached the main entrance. "We cannot let them destroy it." Security forces were already engaged with a group of masked intruders who had breached the outer defenses and were fighting their way toward the chamber that held the tablets. Daniel grabbed a fallen guard's weapon and moved forward despite Laura's protests. "Stay behind me," he ordered as they entered the archive chamber. The scene inside was chaotic as guards exchanged fire with attackers who carried explosive devices strapped to their bodies. One of the intruders saw Daniel and raised his weapon, but Senna tackled the human to the ground just as an energy bolt seared through the air where his head had been. "We need to seal the chamber," Lavra shouted over the noise of battle. Daniel spotted the control panel near the main entrance and began crawling toward it while energy weapons discharged all around him. He reached the panel and slammed his hand against the emergency lockdown switch just as an intruder tried to throw an explosive toward the nearest row of tablets. The blast doors crashed down and caught the explosive device between them, containing the detonation in a shower of sparks and smoke. The remaining intruders were quickly subdued by security forces, and Daniel pulled himself to his feet with relief flooding through his body. "Is everyone all right?" he asked as he looked around the chamber. Senna was shaken but unharmed, and Lara had only minor cuts from flying debris. Tablets stood undamaged in their ancient rows, silent witnesses to an attack that had nearly succeeded. Counselor Vethris arrived within the hour with a full security contingent and barely contained fury in her movements. Who did this? She demanded. And why would anyone want to destroy the archive? Daniel showed her the anonymous message he had received before the attack. Someone does not want these tablets translated, he said. And they are willing to kill to prevent it. The investigation that followed revealed disturbing truths about power and secrecy in galactic society. Senna came to Daniel with information she had gathered from old records and whispered rumors. There is a group called the Sealed Path, she explained, and they have existed for centuries with the single purpose of preventing the archive from being translated. Why? Lavra asked with disbelief in her voice. And what could they possibly fear from ancient knowledge? Senna looked around nervously before continuing. They believe the precursors destroyed themselves, she said quietly, and they fear that their knowledge is cursed and will bring disaster to any species that possesses it. Daniel considered this information as he continued his translation. Work over the following days. The tablets revealed wonders beyond imagination as he deciphered their contents. He read descriptions of technology that could reshape stars and create artificial worlds. He found instructions for energy systems that could power civilizations for millions of years. He discovered medical knowledge that promised to extend life indefinitely and cure every known disease. I understand their fear, he admitted to Laura one evening, because this knowledge could change everything about galactic society, but it could also help billions of people, Lavra argued, and we have no right to hide it from them. Daniel agreed, but he also understood that powerful people had much to lose if the old order changed. Hi. Scholar Yentis appeared unexpectedly at Daniel's quarters with a haunted look in his eyes. I was wrong about you, the old scholar admitted, and I apologize for my hostility and arrogance. Daniel invited him inside and waited for Yentis to continue. I know about the Seal Path, Yentis said heavily, and I have known about them for many years, though I am not a member myself. He explained that the organization had infiltrated the highest levels of galactic government and had worked for centuries to ensure the tablets remained unreadable. They approached me before the attack, Yentis revealed, and they offered me wealth and status if I would sabotage your work. But you refused. Daniel said, I considered it. Yentis admitted with shame in his voice. But then I watched you translate those tablets, and I realized that you were right, and we were all fools. He looked at Daniel with something like respect. The precursors wanted their knowledge to be found, he said, and they designed the test specifically to identify a species worthy of receiving it. A new attack came 3 days later, more coordinated and more dangerous than the first armed. Intruders in military-grade armor stormed the facility from multiple entry points. And this time, they had inside help counselor Vethris herself was revealed as a secret leader of the Seal Path when she used her authority to disable security systems and grant the attackers access to the archive. Daniel found himself cornered in the main chamber with Laura, Senna, and a handful of loyal guards as enemies closed in from all directions. Surrender the translation key, Vethris demanded through a communication device, and we will let you leave alive. And if I refuse, Daniel asked, then you die and the archive burns. She replied coldly. Daniel looked at the tablets surrounding him. 10,000 stones that held the legacy of a civilization that had wanted to share its gifts with the future. He thought about the precursors who designed this test millions of years ago, hoping that someday a species would pass it. Thought about humanity and its chaotic history of languages and cultures that had accidentally prepared them for this moment, and he made his decision. Lavra, he said calmly, open a galaxy-wide broadcast channel. What are you doing? She asked as she worked the controls, sharing knowledge. Daniel replied. He stood before the broadcast camera and began reading translated passages from the tablets while uploading his complete translation key to every major database in the galaxy. This is the gift of the precursors, he announced to billions of watching beings. And it belongs to everyone. Vethris screamed in fury and ordered her forces to attack. But it was already too late. The translation key was spreading across the galaxy at the speed of light. And the secret that the seal path had protected for centuries was now public knowledge. The knowledge could never be suppressed again. The galaxy changed in the weeks following Daniel's broadcast as scholars from 100 worlds began using his translation method to read the precursor tablets. The seal path collapsed almost overnight. When their greatest secret became worthless, and Council of Vethris was arrested along with dozens of her co-conspirators, Danny continued his work in the archive with renewed energy, knowing that enemies could no longer stop what he had started. The final sequence of tablets proved to be the most important of all, containing information that the precursors had saved for last. Senna worked beside him as they translated the concluding messages, her skills growing stronger with each passing day. This passage describes their departure, she said with wonder in her voice, and it explains what happened to the precursors. Millions of years ago, Daniel read the ancient words carefully and felt tears forming in his eyes as he understood their meaning. Precursors had not destroyed themselves, as the sealed path had feared. Instead, they had evolved beyond physical form after reaching a level of advancement that made material existence unnecessary. Before leaving the galaxy forever, they had created the archive as a gift for whatever species might one day prove worthy of inheriting their knowledge. They seeded potential throughout the cosmos, Daniel translated, hoping that one day a species would emerge capable of remembering all tongues. Laura joined them as they worked on the final tablets, and together they uncovered coordinates for a hidden location in an unexplored region of space. This is where they left their legacy, Daniel announced, and this is where we need to go. A joint expedition was organized. Within days, as species that had once dismissed humanity now sought to participate in the greatest discovery in galactic history. The ship that carried them to the coordinates was a marvel of combined technology, crewed by beings from dozens of worlds who had set aside old rivalries for this moment. Daniel stood on the bridge as they approached the target location, with Lara and Senna beside him and representatives from across the galaxy gathered behind them. There, the navigation officer announced with awe in his voice, "We have found it." The precursor station hung in space like a frozen dream, a structure so vast that it dwarfed everything they had ever built. Its surfaces gleamed with materials that defied analysis, and its design spoke of engineering knowledge beyond anything the galaxy had achieved in millions of years. "It has been dormant since the precursors departed," Senna whispered, waiting for someone to arrive. The docking procedures were tense as no one knew what they would find inside. But the station welcomed them as if it had been expecting. Their arrival lights activated as they entered, and systems that had been silent for eons hummed back to life. Daniel walked through corridors that no living being had seen since before Earth existed, and he felt the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. They reached a central chamber where a message awaited them, preserved in crystal that glowed with inner light. Daniel touched the crystal and heard a voice speak directly into his mind, words that crossed the barrier of millions of years. "To those who remember all tongues," the voice said, "welcome and receive the inheritance you have earned." The station opened itself to them, revealing treasures beyond imagination. There were energy sources that could power worlds without pollution or waste. There were medical technologies that could cure diseases and extend life spans. There were terraforming methods that could transform barren rocks into garden planets. There were star maps showing hundreds of other precursor sites scattered across the galaxy. each one containing more gifts for the future. Daniel stood among these wonders with tears streaming down his face as he realized what his simple act of translation had unlocked. High Scholar Yentis approached him with humility, replacing the arrogance that had once defined him. I spent my entire life trying to prevent this moment, Yentis said quietly. And now I understand how wrong I was. He looked at Daniel with genuine respect. Will humanity share this inheritance? He asked. Or will you claim it for yourselves? Daniel thought about the question carefully before answering. He remembered the precursors and their belief that diversity of thought was the greatest treasure. He remembered their faith that someday a species would arise that valued different ways of thinking. He remembered that the test was never about power or ownership, but about worthiness to carry knowledge forward. Knowledge belongs to everyone, Daniel replied. And that is what the precursors wanted, and that is what humanity will ensure. The announcement of shared inheritance sent waves of celebration across the galaxy as species realized they would all benefit from the discovery. Humanity was elevated to founding membership in the Galactic Council, a young species that had proven itself wise beyond its years. Laura found Daniel standing alone on the station's observation deck, looking out at stars that suddenly seemed less cold and distant. What are you thinking about? She asked. I am thinking about my grandmother, Daniel said softly, and how she used to tell me that languages are windows into different ways of seeing the world. He smiled at the memory. She said that every language lost was a window closed forever. He continued, and she made me promise to keep as many windows open as I could. Laura put her hand on his shoulder. I think she would be proud of you, she said. I hope so, Daniel replied. Senna joined them with news that more translations were coming in from across the galaxy as scholars applied Daniel's methods to the remaining tablets. They are finding more secrets, she reported excitedly. And every day brings new discoveries. Daniel nodded with satisfaction because he knew the work was far from finished. The archive still held mysteries waiting to be uncovered, and the other precursor sites would take generations to fully explore. But for the first time in millions of years, the voices of the precursors were being heard again, and it was humanity, the young chaotic species that had never unified its languages, that had made it possible across the galaxy. Scholars of 100 species began studying ancient human scripts, learning Korean and Sumerian and Egyptian and Chinese and all the other languages that humanity had preserved. They were opening windows that had been closed for far too long, and through those windows, the light of knowledge was finally shining again. Daniel looked at the stars and smiled because the future had never seemed brighter. What do we do now? Laura asked. We keep translating, Daniel replied, because I suspect the precursors left many more gifts for us to find, and somewhere in the vast silence of space. Perhaps the precursors were watching, pleased that their faith in the future had finally been rewarded.